How biased is the US media and how difficult is it to fact check a US election? To talk about that and more, we have Peter Fray with us. He's joining us from down under, from Sydney. He's the managing editor of Crikey. But for the purposes of this conversation, he holds multiple hats. He was the editor-in-chief of PolitiFact Australia. He's a fact checker. He's a journalism professor, and he's a former editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. Welcome, Peter, to Boom.
Oh, it's great to be here, and it's great to be talking to you.
Fantastic. My first question, the US media and journalism is so influential around the world, but, people don't realize that the US media as a whole is quite biased on its own, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we see the US media, if you don't live there, right? So like you see it and I see it, in a kind of prism of some of the key brands, and I know we're going to talk about that. But the NYT, the Journal, the Watch Post, CNN, of course, and you kind of get this picture of the U.S. media through those brands, and of course that's not the full picture, far from it. So what we're seeing, I think, is what we're seeing from outside the U.S. is a very different picture from what you're seeing inside the U.S. And the other element, of course, here, and I'm sure we'll get to this, is the capacity of social to change the debate. So I think we're seeing two things happening here broadly, and you and I know this from our own personal experiences. We're seeing a kind of business model that says, let's cater to the people who pay us money. So say NYT, for instance, let's cater to a broadly liberal, progressive audience who want to subscribe and who are broadly, anti-Trump. And then there's another element to this, which is the kind of the way that social media, in particular Facebook, but others, are sort of eroding the kind of, if you like, the bias towards balance. And what it really does, and we've been talking about this for several years now, but it's still profound, I think, that the balance issue is being overtaken by a partisan issue. So I will subscribe to whoever reinforces, my own views. So it's very hard, I think, to see the media in a kind of like an aspect. It's not. It's struggling. It's fighting for its audience, and it's fighting against many forces all at the same time.
Right. So, I want to leave the notion of the facts to the side for a second. It seems to me you're saying that for an average American, there is the Republican press and then there is the Democratic press. And for them, it's a question of whom to believe, whose facts to believe, if you want to put it that way.
Of course, and Trump has made it this debate, and for all the attempts of journalism in the US to fight that, and I give, I acknowledge that many journalists in the US have been fighting this for a long time, for this last 4 years or more. Trump, in a way, has won this debate. I hate to say this, but I think he's won this debate. I think he's won this debate, that this whole fake news media kind of argument. I think it really pains me to say this, but I think Trump has won the debate insofar as we now have an absolutely polarized media, a media that reflects, even when you see the cleverness of Trump is even when something, let's say the NYT, seeks to be balanced or seeks to run a story, say, as it did the other day about Trump's tax returns, Trump has skewed the debate such that, oh, well, that's just the biased, fake news media. Now, you and I know that that's a crock of crap, and that is a terrible moment, a blight, really, on the world's media and the world's capacity to have free and open debate. But what we see, and especially within the kind of crucible of an election campaign, is this sort of everything becomes ridiculously extreme. So there's a really interesting question here that's sort of implicit in every question I think you have, which is, what is the business model of media? Who are we catering for? Is there a notion that we're catering for everyone? and all you got to do is sign up and you'll be illuminated by media? Or are we actually catering for the audiences that are willing to pay for us? And that, to me, is a fundamental question about media, not just in the United States. I think it's a fundamental question across the world.
Indeed. And, speaking of Trump, there's a question of Donald Trump's lies. And we've seen so many accounts of how many lies he is spun out every day of his presidency, almost. And so my question then is, what does the media do when your president obviously tells a lie? I mean, if you call out a lie, which is what you should do as a journalistic organization, you might be seen as biased. So how does, we're getting into fact-checking territory here. Really, what do we do with the lies of Donald Trump? I mean, we don't see too many headlines saying Donald Trump spoke a lie at such and such a speech. So what do we do in such a situation?
Yeah, no, I that's a wonderful question, a pretty sad question, but it's a wonderful question. So I think what we're seeing is there are some people, many people, let's not get too pessimistic. There are many people who go, yes, that's a lie, and Donald Trump is lying. I think what's the current rate, 5 or 6 a day, and it has been throughout his presidency. So there are many people who go, that's a lie, yes, I'll never vote for that person. There are lots and lots and lots of people who go, oh, well, do I really care? I mean, do I really care that the lies are called out? I think one thing that Trump's lies have done is expose this terrible realization for news media that sadly, of course, that lots of people don't really pay attention to it. So you could call Donald Trump a rapist and a murderer, and they wouldn't even hear it, and they wouldn't necessarily change their vote. So I think we're seeing the limitations of the news media. Really, I mean, it really pains me to say it, but I think we're seeing the limitations of the news media to change votes and change hearts and minds. What to do about Trump? Well, there isn't a lot to do other than to keep doing what you're doing, right? So you ask all the right questions, you expose the lies, you seek to find his tax returns when they're not being, provided. You seek to understand, all the crap that he goes on with, as you would with any politician. Trump is an outlier, of course, but you would do that with any politician. You would seek to expose their truths and their untruths.
Right.
So, I think the question really is more about audience. I think we've reached a moment in time where, the audiences are perhaps, not all of them, but 60%, maybe 50%, whatever the number is, are kind of post-truth. And that suits Trump. I'm still not, it's still possible, I think, that Trump could get re-elected. And
yes, indeed.
Go on.
Right. On that note, we are seeing the likes of the Washington Post and CNN say that they will not get into the business of predicting whether Trump is going to win or not. But that may not be what a large majority of the media does. But, getting into the business of fact-checking itself, how difficult really is it to fact-check a politician's speech? It's not just Donald Trump, but pretty much everyone. Aaron Cherokman, who's the managing editor of PolitiFact in the United States, says it can take a lot of time. It takes days. It takes a lot of research. And you've run PolitiFact as well. So how difficult really is it to fact-check a politician and fact-check a U.S. election? Yeah.
No, very, very, very hard. Fact-checking in real time remains a little bit of a dream. There's some great progress along that lines, and we'll talk about that in a second, I'm sure. But the problem is the volume of lies, and the other problem is in an election campaign. And I'll give you an example from my own experiences. So I fact-checked, say, the 2013 Australian election. And I had a deal with a commercial TV station. They paid me $300,000. It was a great deal. I was on TV 2 or 3 times a night. It was all wonderful. At the end of that election campaign, the contract came up for renewal, and I said, well, we're going to renew it, yeah? And they said, well, no, not really. And I said, why is that? And they said, oh, well, the election campaign's over. And I said, well, but do you think they've stopped lying? And of course, they haven't stopped lying. And I think there's this kind of strange media cycle that goes on, that we should fact check them when they're lying. Well, politicians bend the truth all the time, and I'm not just only talking about Trump. They bend the truth all the time. Donald Trump is not just an outlier; he's stratospheric, really. There's never been a liar like him. He has no compulsion to tell the truth. He would know the truth if it bit him on the ass. So I think that presents a real problem for fact checkers, because you have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it is, lies a day to fact check. And if it takes you 6 hours even, but often it takes you 18 hours or 24 hours to fact check, the caravan has moved on. That's kind of what you're saying.
Right.
The caravan has moved on, and there's another 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lies to fact check. So it's a volume argument. It's a volume argument that you can never keep on touch. I'll tell you one other thing about this, actually, I think, is that fact checkers, and it's inherent in fact checking, and I think it's a flaw in fact checking. There's 2 flaws in fact checking as far as I see. One is fact checkers want to cover the universe such that they want to prove without a shadow of doubt that what they're saying is true. And that does build in a lot of time, because if you want to, I remember doing a fact check that lasted for 6 days, and it was, by that time, the caravan had moved on. So fact checking is slow, and I think fact checkers need to work out how they can make it faster. And the second thing is, and this I think is a fundamental question around fact checking that's linked to news media organizations need to get those media organizations to agree to use those fact checks. And I'll give you an example. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation has a fact check unit with a university, RMIT in Melbourne. They do a fine job. They get lots of fact checks out. They're a bit slow, but nonetheless, the fundamental question is this: why don't journalists ask the politicians that are questioning questions that relate to the fact checks that have been done? I'll tell you why, and we can debate this. It's a great question, I think. Journalists are a bit addicted to the quote of the day, to the grab, and sometimes, quite often actually, asking them a factual question runs counter to the grab. So you want the grab because the grab is outrage, and the outrage sells you clicks, and it sells you ratings on the TV, one thing or another. So a boring old fact-based question actually probably isn't going to get you the grab. And this to me is like the fundamental problem we have with the journalism model. Journalism model says conflict, grabs, outrageous statements. And what we are talking about tonight is facts. So we need to put a primacy on facts.
Yes.
And there's no primacy on facts, right? So I want that grab. It doesn't run. It runs counter to, why don't I ask him, why don't I ask the Prime Minister or the President, that statement you just made has been fact-checked by, X, Y, Z. Why are you repeating it, Prime Minister / President? Because you know it to be untrue. We never hear journalists in the White House room on the campaign trail asking that question. I have to say, in my experience in the last decade, I've never heard a journalist say something like, well, that was fact-checked by, blah, 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 and it was proven to be a lie.
Indeed.
Why do you keep repeating it? Journalists need to, if journalists really want to adhere to fact-checking, then they need to adhere to fact-checking. I think this is a fundamental problem in the business model of journalism.
Yes, we started with bias and then went over to fact checking and moved on. as ever to problems in the structure and the system of not just politics, but media. And indeed, competition is something that brings down journalists a lot of the times. Collaboration perhaps is the need of the hour. On that note, I'm going to ask you a last question, Peter. It seems like even from within the United States or outside the United States, we just don't know what's going to happen come election night.
No, we don't. We have no idea. I've been thinking about this myself with my own website. What do we do? I guess I've been talking to Bill Adair, who is, the father of fact checking in the United States. He thinks that, Trump won't leave the White House even if he loses. So, I mean, God knows what happens then. I think this is a real challenge for journalism. This election is a real challenge for journalism. It's more of a challenge to journalism than 2016 because we've had 4 years of exposure to Trump. And I think it's quite fascinating and slightly troubling, I think, that two things are happening in the United States in particular. One is there's this kind of people are riding the kind of what if Trump wins kind of argument. They're kind of hedging their bets. And the other is people being sucked in by the show. So Trump is a showman, we all know that. He's a TV personality if he's nothing else. And people in this last week, they've been sucked in by the Trump show. And to me, that isn't journalism. That's kind of cult of celebrity. And I think journalists need to kind of think about how we do this last week, because if we're going to be sucked in by the cult of Trump, and the remarkable, look, he's a great showman. No one's disputing that. The fact is, he's the greatest liar this nation, this world has ever seen. I mean, he is the greatest liar, and we shouldn't ever forget that he is the greatest liar as a president we've ever seen, and will be, I think, forever. So, if we're doing our job, we should basically keep getting back to that fundamental. Donald Trump is a liar. He's been the worst president in the history of the United States. He should be called out as such.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Peter. Challenge to journalism, challenge to democracy, challenge to US democracy in particular. Thanks so much. It's been entertaining talking to you as always.
Thanks. Thank you. Lovely to speak to you, Venkat.